God, may the words of my mouth, with the meditation of our hearts, be pleasant before you this morning. God, may I decrease so you may increase. Amen. How many of you guys have heard in the past couple of weeks about this giant white balloon that entered into the space of the United States? I'll be honest, I was a little bit late to the party. The first time I looked at it was I was going through my social media page on Facebook, and I saw this picture that it said, "Good night table, good night moon, good night Chinese spy balloon." And I looked at that and I was wondering, what in the world were they talking about? And believe it or not, your search engines, either Alexa or Google or whoever it is that you use, usually will track your history on what you look at it. So I put in there, right? I mean, white balloon, enter into the space, coming from China based on what I read. And the second image that I got was this one. And as you can tell, I'm a Patriots fan, so this one hurt a little bit and hit a little bit close to home. But I still was trying to figure out what in the world, what all this meant. So I erased it in, and I just put it in there, right? Government, white balloon. And it was the image that came. We have extended trying to contact about your car's extended warranty. And this is what I discovered. You can hear one news about one topic, and different sources will tell you different things about the same thing. Can you believe it? Can you believe that if something is happening on the news, CNN and Fox News will tell you different things of that story? That what the left thinks about one thing is different than what the right think, and what the middle think, whatever that means. And the more that I've been wrestling with that, the more I have been discovering that we do the same when it comes down to the Bible. That you can get one Bible story, and somebody on one side will tell you what they think, and somebody on the other side will tell you a complete different story and meaning about the same Bible story. Can you believe that we do that as humans? Even with the most common or perhaps, simple concepts, we do that. Right? Let's talk about Jesus. When was Jesus born? Anyone? It's not a rhetorical question. This is like Bible 101. When was Jesus born? Some people will argue that he was born on December 25th. And others will argue that that is actually not possible. That it was most likely on the summer months, Aprilish, based on shepherds being on the field, based on astrology and how they work. Some people will argue that he was born in a manger. And others will argue that that's actually not really how it took place. Most likely it was a cave. Some others will argue that there were 3 wise men to come and see him. And they have gave them names. And the animal that each one of them was riding. An elephant or a camel or a donkey. And some others will argue that most likely there were more than 3. Because they travel in groups. Maybe they have 3 presents, but they were more than 3. Some others will argue that it was a silent night when he was born. And every other mother on planet Earth will argue that was nothing but silent that night. You see, then we can go at Jesus' stories, right? And we can pick up any story. Let me start with the first one. Does anybody remember which one was the first miracle that Jesus made? Turn water into wine. I was reading a couple of articles where they were arguing what kind of wine Jesus turned into. Sauvignon Blanc, Rosé, Pinot Gris. And others were arguing like, I don't really care as long as Jesus can come to my house and do it in there. Then we even can look at Jesus' death, right? When Jesus died on the cross, the Bible story tells us that he was, buried in a tomb. And on the third day, a woman came and saw that tomb empty. And people will say that the first preachers ever of the resurrection story were women. And some others will argue that that doesn't really matter, that women should not even be preaching. And we do that with every single story. So I want us to look at today another story, and I'm going to ask Esther to come and read the story for us. A story that perhaps you have heard before, a story that perhaps you may be familiar, and a story that often we just get one particular interpretation. It's in the book of Genesis chapter 22, the first 18 verses.
창세기 22장 1절에서 19절. 그 일 후에 하나님이 아브라함을 시험하시려고 그를 부르시되 아브라함 하시니 그가 가로되 내가 여기 있나이다. 여호와께서 가라사대 내 아들 내 사랑하는 독자 이삭을 데리고 모리아 땅으로 가서 내가 내게 지시하는 한 산 거기서 그를 번제로 드리라. 아브라함이 아침에 일찍이 일어나고 나귀에 앉아 을 지우고 두 사환과 그 아들 이삭을 데리고 번제에 쓸 나무를 쪼개어 가지고 떠나 하나님의 자기에게 지시하시는 곳으로 가더니 제3일에 아브라함이 눈을 들어 그곳을 멀리 바라본지라. 이에 아브라함이 사환에게 이르되 너희는 나귀와 함께 여기서 기다리라. 내가 아이와 함께 저기 가서 경배하고 너희에게로 돌아오리라 하고 아브라함이 이에 번제 나무를 취하여 그 아들 이삭에게 지우고 자기는 불과 칼을 손에 들고 두 사람이 동행하더니 이삭이 그 아비 아브라함에게 말하여 가로되 내 아버지여 하니 그가 가로되 내 아들아 내가 여기 있노라. 이삭이 가로되 불과 나무를 있거니와 번제할 어린 양은 어디 있나이까. 아브라함이 가로되 아들아 번제할 어린 양은 하나님이 자기를 위하여 친히 준비하시리라 하고 두 사람이 함께 나아가서 하나님이 그에게 지시하신 곳에 이른지라. 이에 아브라함이 그곳에 단을 싸고 나무를 버려놓고 그 아들 이삭을 결박하여 단 나무 위에 놓고 손을 내밀어 칼을 잡고 그 아들을 잡으려 하더니 여호와의 사자가 하늘에서부터 그를 불러가리 가라사대 아브라함아 아브라함아 하시는지라. 아브라함이 가로되 내가 여기 있나이다 하매 사자가 가라사대 그 아이에게 내 손을 대지 말라. 아무 일도 그에게 하지 말라. 내가 내 아들 내 독자라도 내게 아끼지 아니하였으니 내가 이제야 내가 하나님을 경외하는 줄을 아노라. 아브라함이 눈을 들어 살펴본즉 한 수양이 뒤에 있는데 뿔이 수풀에 걸렸는지라. 아브라함이 가서 그 수양을 가져다가 아들을 대신하여 번제로 드렸더라. 아브라함이 그 땅 이름을 여호와이라 하였으므로 오늘까지 사람들이 이르기를 여호와의 산에서 준비되리라 하더라. 여호와의 사자가 하늘에서부터 두 번째 아브라함을 불러 가라사대 여호와께서 이르시기를 내가 나를 가리켜 맹세하노니 내가 이같이 행하여 내 아들 내 독자를 아끼지 아니하였은즉 내가 내게 큰 복을 주고 내 씨로 크게 성하여 하늘의 별과 같고 바닷가의 모래와 같게 하리니 내 씨가 그 대적의 문을 얻으리라. 또 내 씨로 말미암아 천 만민이 복을 얻으리니 이는 내가 나의 말을 주행하였음이니라 하셨다 하니라. 이에 아브라함이 그 사환에게로 들어와서 함께 떠나 브엘세바에 이르러 거기 거하였더라.
Amen. Thank you, Esther. See, we're in this sermon series called Voices, and I want to maybe make the guess that maybe everyone who is in this room and everyone who is watching at home would like to hear the voice of God. Anyone out there who would like to hear the voice of God? And you know, this story took, thousands and thousands of years ago. And I wonder, okay, what it would look like right now to hear the voice of God. And what I'm realizing based on my statement earlier about, right, I mean, hearing one voice but hearing different sides of the story, is it's not really about the fact if God is speaking or not. It's about if God's speaking, what are we listening? If God is speaking, what are you hearing when God is speaking? You see, because this story is one of those stories that most Christians use as the story of epitome of faith, right? If you want to, define what faith is, you will tell this story. You will use this story to hear how a man was willing to sacrifice the only child that he had. So what I want to do this morning is perhaps raise a case that maybe Abraham did hear the voice of God, but maybe actually Abraham didn't do what God wanted him to do. And let me tell you why. I'll tell you three things. The first one is, after this moment, Genesis 22, chapter 1 and 18, after that event took place, there is no biblical testimony that God and Abraham spoke again. And even the moment when, the story, you read the story, right? It says that Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, and it was a messenger. It wasn't God itself. Now it was a messenger who spoke to Abraham and said, stop. So it makes me wonder if Abraham did the right thing. Shouldn't that have drawn him and God closer? But after Abraham listened to the voice of God, God never spoke to Abraham again. Here's my second point. After this moment, there is no biblical testimony that Abraham and Isaac spoke again to each other. No, and I get it, right? It was I can only imagine how traumatic a scene was that. But if really this was God's plan, shouldn't still goodness have come out of that, and that relationship should have gotten stronger? Even later on, you read when Abraham's wife, Sarah, and Isaac's mom passed away, they did not even grieve together. And here's my third point. If Abraham indeed did the right thing, shouldn't God maybe have named his people after Abraham, the people of Abraham? But eventually God goes and called these people the people of Israel, Abraham's grandson, who was perhaps a great man, but he didn't do what Abraham did. So I raise my point. Maybe Maybe Abraham heard God's voice, but what if Abraham didn't hear what God wanted him to do? What if when God speaks to us, it's about this idea to try to have a relationship in a conversation with us and God so we can know who God is and what God is doing? What if it goes beyond just a monologue, but actually this idea that we can have a conversation with God? You see, the interesting thing is that prior to this story, that's what Abraham's and God's relationship was all about. You see, in Genesis 18, you hear this story when God said to Abraham, you know what, there is these two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'm just going to destroy them because there has been enough sin in them. And that story, Abraham said like, whoa, 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 God. What if there is one just person there? What if there are 10? What if there are 50? And the story, if you look at it, then it says God engaged in a conversation with Abraham and said, okay, that's fine. We'll do it your way. Let's see if there are just people in there. So in that story, Abraham, not only he heard the voice of God, he understood that he could have a relationship with God and talk to God. Some may argue that this is the only time in the Bible where God has changed his mind, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But yet, when God asked him, I need you to kill your son, Abraham said, like, okay. No, as a father of 5, I cannot even imagine what would that look like. And when I was writing the sermon, I was just coming up with all the excuses or the argument that I would give back to God. Say, if I would have been and only have one child, right? It took 100 years for me to have that child. Say, God, I really need to make sure you're telling me this because I only have one and I cannot make a mistake. Maybe I need a bigger sign than just hearing a voice because I don't know if it's your voice or right now something that I ate earlier or I don't know what it may be. Well, I wouldn't argue, say, God, do you understand what this is going to do to my wife, to this mother's child? It just makes no sense that you would like me to do this. I may even argue, God, just think about what kind of reputation this will give you with all the nations. Why on earth anybody would like to follow you if this is what you're asking us? Now, I'm going to be honest with you. This theory that I just raised, it's based on really poor exegetical work. What that means is it's based in really poor interpretation of the Bible. Usually when I preach or people will preach, will tell you based on what the Bible said. All this case that I just raised was based on what the Bible doesn't say. But it doesn't say if they had a conversation, God and Abraham, or not. I just made the assumption that they didn't, but it doesn't say that. It doesn't say if Abraham and Isaac ever talk again. I made the assumption that they didn't, but it's silence about that. But my point this morning is when God speaks to us, because I believe we have a God that speaks. Because when there's people all around the world in different countries, in different places in this community, through different voices, and we ask God, God, can you speak to us? I believe God speaks to us. My question is, when God speaks, what is God saying? My point is, when God speaks, what is God saying? Could it be that if you look at the story of Jesus, if you look how God interacts throughout history in this book, that when God speaks, often is to protect, to defend, and to intercede for those who don't have a voice. When God's voice is being heard by people, often it is so they can protect, intercede, and defend those who have no voice. It blows my mind in this story how the one that we don't hear a lot about or at all is the child named Abraham, the child named Isaac. And some historians will argue about his age, and some of them will say that he was a teenager, and I cannot even imagine what a scene that would have been, raising and laying down your teenager. And using the words, well, this is what God is saying. Makes me wonder how often we misuse God's words to advance our own agenda. I shared with you guys on Christmas Day a story that happened to me years ago that was, I follow Jesus, but like a little bit, kind of thing in those days. And I shared with you how at some point I found myself in a car accident where I got, my side of the story is that I got hit by a goat. The goat's side of the story is that she or he, I don't know what it was, got hit by a car. And I got out of my car and I saw the whole dent in my hood, and I was furious about it. And I looked around to see who was the owner of the goat so somebody can cover the expense of the dent in my hood. And finally, I looked around and there was this gentleman carrying or walking with more goats. So I did the math and suggested that he was the owner of the goat. And started arguing with him about covering the expense of my car. And he started arguing with me about covering the expense of his goat. and as we start that argument, things start getting heated. And all of a sudden, I found myself surrounded for roughly around 15 to 20 people that live in that community with the goat owner. And my righteousness way of thinking is like, I don't care that your goat die. You have to pay for my car accident. And completely disregard my first world damage versus somebody's lifestyle. And as things got heated, I approached the back of my car and I took a baseball bat because I knew things were not going to go well. And as things continued to be heated, I had two choices. Either swing the bat or perhaps seek for peace. Well, I didn't follow Jesus that much. And I couldn't comprehend somebody's pain in the other side of the story. So as things got heated, I swung the bat. And I was able to swing the bat maybe 3, maybe 4 times before I was in the ground. And I share this with you because it is so easy to go through life justifying what we want and what we need, completely disregarding somebody else's pain. Especially when we don't take the time to hear the side of their story, to hear their voice. You see, you have some Legos in front of you. My kids love to play with Legos. And when they finish playing with Legos, there's 2 ways you clean up Legos. Well, there's 3. The first one is they don't clean at all, right? They just leave a mess. And there's nothing worse than as a parent walking up at 3 in the morning in the dark without shoes and stepping up on Lego. I don't care what language you speak, some words will come out of your mouth. But in those remote cases, when they clean up their Legos, there's 2 ways you can clean up Legos. One, you can destroy whatever it is that you just built. The second is you can deconstruct whatever it is that you just built. And there's a difference between destroying a structure and deconstructing a structure. Destroying a structure, mostly you just take it apart. And because we're humans and we're sinful, most likely you're going to build the same structure without paying attention in the mistake that you make. When you deconstruct a structure, you take the time to figure it out what was wrong. My friends, throughout history, we have built structure after structure and system after system that are built with the main purpose of not giving voice to certain group of people. So what it would look like if the people of God, instead of swinging bats based on our righteousness, and instead of just destroying something and then building it again, take the time to pray, God, who are those voices that need to be heard? And what is your role for us as that church in deconstructing those systems so we don't repeat them again? Because there's no story in this book that I read where God doesn't have the best interest of people at heart. And often are the people of God who get on the way. So let me ask you this question to you today. Do you want God to speak to you? Do you want to hear the voice of God? If that is the case, are you willing to do whatever it is that God says? Are you willing to be used by God so perhaps others can experience God for the first time? Let us pray. God, we read stories like the story of Abraham and Isaac. And whether we use one interpretation of the story or another one, God, we're still going to put our lenses through that story. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do right now, God, is acknowledge the reality that, God, that you're a God that continues to speak to your people. God, but you speak in us and through us and despite of us, God. So perhaps those who our systems and our theologies tell us that they couldn't and shouldn't hear your voice, keep him pushed aside. So God, we pray this morning that you'll give us a heart to hear you. God, and that you will give us the courage to follow what you're saying.